I want to continue with our talk about the three levels of cognition of neuroscience, cognitive therapy, and on cognitive therapy. So this is the second part of this on cognitive psychology. And the reason that I'm going into such depth about this is because I want to explain how it is that we all have experiences and we have feelings and we have thoughts about those situations and experiences that we have. But we also have the option of how it is that we talk to ourselves when we have those thoughts and feelings. We can have the thoughts and feelings, but then those are automatic. They just happen. But we can also learn how to talk back to those things, and I want to be able to explain how that happens in a little bit more detail. So that's why I want to talk about cognitive psychology, which is the study of how the brain is functioning. So I want to talk a little bit about how we see things. So, for example, if we look at a table, we see the table and we think, oh, I know what this table is. But what if I told you that this table is actually jumping in and out of existence? That would sound very strange. But in fact, there's some evidence for that. First, when we see a table, we actually don't see the table at all. We see a mental representation of the table based on our senses. In this case, our eye sense, which sees the table. The light bounces off the table into our eye, onto the retina. There is a special chemical process that goes on called phototransduction that then turns this into electrical signals that go across the brain, through the optic chiasm, across the lateral geniculate nucleus area, into the optic radiations, and then into the occipital region of the brain, Brodmann's areas 17, 18, and 19, where we actually see a mental representation of the brain that is based on our sensory organ. If you had electron microscopes, for example, instead of the eyes that you have, you would see a completely different level of the table. You would see the table, if you had a microscope, you would see it at one level. You go deeper and deeper and deeper, and eventually you would see that the molecules and the atoms and the parts, the subatomic particles that are in the atoms, you would all go down to the quark level, fermions. You would see that these are actually jumping in and out of existence at a very fast rate, much faster than we could see. So this awareness that we have, that we see things from this level, is very, very important. Bertrand Russell, one of the scariest people that I've actually ever seen here, his picture, he says, my knowledge of the brain, my knowledge of the table as a physical object, on the contrary, is not direct knowledge. Such as it is obtained through the acquaintance with the sense data that make up the appearance of the table. We have seen that it is possible without absurdity to doubt whether there is a table at all, whereas it is not possible to doubt the sense data. My knowledge of the table of this kind is what we would call knowledge of description. The table is the physical object which causes such and such sense data. This describes the table by means of sense data. There is no state of mind in which we are directly aware of the table. So in fact, when we look at things at the deepest level, we see that the table is actually, and all matter is actually jumping in and out of existence. The form is becoming energy. It's empty of formness. 2,500 years ago, actually, long before quantum physics, before the electron microscope, there was one person who said that the inside of an object there's a smaller object, and inside of that is a smaller object, and the smaller object until you get to something so small that it is jumping in and out of existence, like a bubble, like a flash of lightning. I don't know if you know who that person might be. That's actually Gautama Buddha, 2,500 years ago. How he knew that, I don't know. Another problem that we have in terms of our viewing of things is that the time that it takes for the experience to get from the eye to the back of the brain is actually a third to a half of a second, which in fact is oftentimes too slow for our experience. If we're driving a car, for example, a half of a second is a long time. If we're a baseball player and we're trying to swing at a pitch, a half of a second is a long time. So in fact, we have to be able to estimate what we're going to experience before we actually get the full picture. We didn't know until recently how that happened, but in fact there's a part of the brain called the lateral geniculate nucleus that's located partway between the eye and the visual cortex, and that part of the brain actually can get what's called a gist image of what it is that we're going to be seeing based on our experience in about a tenth of a second or less. That's pretty important that we're able to do that. That's why when we're very young, we're not given car keys because we don't have enough experience. When we drive, we practice over and over again, and then we can kind of get the gist of what happens. We've all had the experience, in fact, of driving along and we want to change lanes, and suddenly we realize, oh, I think there's a car behind me on that side. We're experienced. We got a gist image of that. Even though it may not have registered completely, we had just a sense of it, and that's kept us from having that accident. But if you were a young driver, we might make that mistake. So all of these parts of the brain interconnect with each other. We're able to see that image gets referred to the spatial and temporal areas of the brain, and eventually it ends up in the prefrontal cortex where we can actually say the word to ourselves. We know what this is. It is a table. Some years ago, I had an experience where I began to lose my eyesight. And I have actually experienced blindness about 5 times since I was in my mid to late 40s. This was something that, at first was, this is quite interesting to see the world from a different point of view. Actually, as I speak to you right now, I am legally blind. I'm not able to drive a car or read very well at all. Just a very blurry world. It's like being inside of a Monet picture. But I do my best with all of it, and my mind just perceives this as just an alternative way of seeing things. I'm just seeing into the heart of things in a different way. Not too much disturbance about it. So these matter and energy jumping back and forth between each other, we're unable to see it. This happens so fast. But if you want to learn more about this, you can go to Best Buy and you can learn about refresh rates from a person there, and they'll show you a nice TV, and they can say that this TV, the pixels are changing at a rate of so many hertz per second. Much faster than what the eye can see. And this is how it is that we view the world. The eye actually only sees what's called visible light. Visible light is thin, like a thinness of a dime, but the actual visual light goes from includes all light spectrum, goes all the way from New York to California, but we only see one sliver of it. I will continue with this topic a little bit more in my next video. I hope that this gives you a sense of humility and understanding that all that we think about, all that we see, the things that we rely on are subject to what level we're able to understand it. So I hope that this information is helpful to you to have some perspective. Thank you for listening.